G'day, I'm Owen. You've joined the pub test, and this video I was not planning to do straight away, but I've listened to all of your comments and you highlighted a few things that need consideration, and also particularly one thing that needs a correction because I got something slightly wrong in the last video, and it does actually make a big difference to this whole discussion. Now, if you haven't seen the last video, there's a link in the description if you want to check out the original one. But could Charles Lechmere have committed the crime in Bucks Row? Well, let's put it to the pub test. Now, straight away, I'm going to mention the correction I need to make. I stated that Lechmere may have had to have carried some of the body parts out of Bucks Row, but was pointed out very well in comments, Polly Nichols had no body parts removed from her, unlike victims later on. So that was not on the radar, so to speak, for this particular crime. And that actually changes things massively. And it leaves us with two options. That Lechmere himself had perpetrated the crime, was just about to do the regular Jack the Ripper surgery, and then Robert Paul starts coming into Bucks Row, and that disturbs him, so he has to stop. Or Lechmere himself came into Bucks Row and disturbed the person who had committed the crime, and that person slipped away into the night. And as we know, that list of people could be huge. We could have Robert Donston Stevenson, Edward Buchan, Francis Thompson, Jacob Levy, perhaps even George Hutchinson, or a number of other ones that I haven't mentioned yet, but if you're interested in one, it's probably covered here on the channel, so go back through and have a quick look. But the question is, though, where was the blood on the hands? Well, we're going to touch on that a little bit later in the video with a possible explanation, but where did he stash the knife? See, it's not proven that he had an apron. It's a fair assumption to say that he did, but could he have hidden his knife somewhere? Well, you know, it's actually not that hard. You see, you can stash a knife anywhere. Now, this isn't real, it's wooden, so don't anyone stress about it. But yeah, you could easily just slip that up your sleeve, you disappear, you walk away. Now, if I'm the prosecutor and police brought this information to me after the Annie Chapman crime, with similar injuries, except now there was some surgery performed on her, I would start to think back to this event in Bucks Row, suggesting that perhaps it was Robert Paul who disturbed Lechmere. See, I could make that connection. Now, if I'm the defense lawyer, I'm getting a little bit nervous looking at that particular piece of evidence. Because he said he didn't hear anybody. Lechmere himself did not hear Robert Paul until he was quite close. Now, he should have heard him when he entered Bucks Row, or was at least going past the scene where Polly Nichols was, if they were walking at about the same time. But there is more to look at the crime scene itself. So we are not convicting him yet, or not prosecuting him yet. But now, I mentioned the time that he left home between 3:20 or 3:30. Now, interestingly, there are a couple of reports that state that he said that he left home at 3:30. Another one says that he left home at 3:20. I intentionally ignored the 3:30 statement. And you'll be sitting there saying, why, Owen? Why on earth would you leave that piece of information out? Well, a couple of reasons. It was reported in the press, and the press got a few of the details wrong. And to me, it didn't make sense that he had to get all the way to Pickford's. And we're going to get into the walking time and how long it would have taken him a bit later. But the point is, I doubt that he regularly left home at 3:30. Because Robert Paul who ran into him apparently for the first time that night in 1888 in Bucks Row, lived near Bucks Row. And for him to get to work, he walked Bucks Row and up Hanbury Street, and he worked at the end of Hanbury Street. So you would assume that Lechmere and Robert Paul would have crossed paths if Lechmere had at times left at that earlier point of 3:30. But I'd suggest that if he did leave at 3:30, that would almost prove that he couldn't have committed the crimes. And I'll state why. Because Polly Nichols was out on the street looking for her DOS money, the money she needed to get a room for the evening. Now, she would not have been patrolling Bucks Row for that particular clientele. She would have been out more on the main Whitechapel Road area. Or was it called Commercial Street? Regardless, the street over from Bucks Row. Because that's where other people were, and that's where she could negotiate her deal and then go and find a secluded spot. It's not like Lechmere would have just stumbled across her walking up Bucks Row. So you needed the time to go find the person, have that conversation, and then come back into Bucks Row. I doubt he left home at 3:30 if he was the perpetrator of the crime, because he just wouldn't have been able to complete all of that in such a short amount of time. But I really don't think the time that he says he left home has any bearing, because we cannot take his word for it. So if I'm the prosecutor, I'm not bringing it up, because the 3:30 time almost makes him look innocent. But if I'm the defense side, I'm not bringing it up either. And you'd say, but Owen, hang on. Doesn't that show that he could not have had the time to perform this action? Well, you'd think so, but perception is an amazing thing. And something that you think could definitely prove someone to be either innocent or guilty can get flipped around in court. And we may remember the O.J. Simpson saga. Now, it was a fair time ago, but many of you out there no doubt remember the scene, because it was portrayed around the world, no doubt, on the news, because here's this car with this celebrity in it, well known in the United States because he was a gridiron player, also well known around the world because he got into acting as well. And now this car's not on a high-speed chase, but just cruising down the highway with police cars around, helicopters, press everywhere, and they're trying to get him to pull over because they found a couple of dead bodies back at his house. And that made him look guilty as anything. But the defense obviously never brought this up at trial because they knew it painted O.J. Simpson in a very, very bad light. But the prosecution never brought this up at trial either, and it was one of the first celebrity trials ever televised. Every day was streamed on a network. So why did the prosecution not use that footage and ask him that question, even though I don't think he took the stand himself, but why did they not raise it to the jury? Have a look at this. What do you think? Don't you think he's guilty? Well, the reason they didn't, and again, they were worried that the jury might feel sympathy for O.J. Simpson. How? Well, he was African American. And even though this event happened before the Black Lives Matter really kicked off in recent times, the defense team very well could have highlighted, here's this African American man, a crime's been committed at his house. He's now worried what's going to happen to him. The police are going to pin it on him. Who knows what they might do to him? So he wanted enough time so he could get out and make sure he got a lawyer, and that people were watching so that he didn't end up face down on the ground, knees in his back, and being treated very badly. Now, I'm not saying at all that that would have happened. But I'm saying if I'm on the defense team, I'm going to raise that. And there were African American people on the jury. And you know what? They would have thought, it's true. We don't get treated the same way. Now, I did not understand myself white privilege and why that would have worked with African American people on that jury until I heard what Michael Holding, Whispering Death. No, he didn't kill anybody. If you follow cricket, you'd know who I'm talking about, but he was a West Indian cricketer. And yes, the West Indies only exists in cricket, but they all the Calypso Islands around form a team, they play. He was being interviewed during this Black Lives Matter movement, and he explained it, I think, most succinctly than I've ever heard before. He was quite emotional in doing so, but effectively he said, if a white person goes into a place, people aren't suspicious of them immediately. They need to do something wrong. But someone of colour goes into a place and people are suspicious of them immediately. They don't need to do anything wrong without people looking at them like they are criminals. So I get that. It made a lot of sense to me. So I could now see why the prosecution would not have shown that car chase, because the defence could very well, very easily have swung that around and got the members of the jury on side. Now let's get back to the Jack the Ripper saga. I was just making that slight tangent just to prove the point as to why proving something in an investigation is different to proving beyond reasonable doubt at a trial. And as I say, Charles Lechmere saying he left at 3:30, I would not mention if I was the defence. And again, you'd say, why? Because if I'm the prosecutor, I've got some questions. I'd be saying, you left home at 3:30 and you've never run in to Robert Paul before. He was a total stranger to you. And yet he walks that road every day at the same time. Surely you would have crossed paths at some point. Is it true that you only said that because you read the newspaper reports that Robert Paul gave at least 2 interviews to journalists and they were printed, and you're saying you didn't read those reports? I mean, you were at the scene. This was front page news. Surely you would have checked to see what he had to say about the subject. So would it be true that you gave a statement to match his version of events? Now, see, that may or may not be true. But the point is, you are sowing that seed in the jury's mind. And that's why I don't think either side would really worry about using the time he left his house. And personally, I go back to the fact that we cannot trust exactly what he said. But we will get onto shortly a good reason as to why. He may have been a bit cagey and may have come up with a little bit of a story that's not 100% true. Now, the thing with blood on the hands was also raised in comments and suggested that he may have been wearing gloves and that would be easy to stash if he was wearing that apron. But the other factor is the mode of dispatching Polly Nichols being restricting that blood flow first. Because apparently when someone gets strangled, it lowers the blood pressure hugely. And so when you start cutting the person open, because there's less pressure, there is less flow. That's just simple plumbing 101. More pressure equals more flow, I believe. I'm not a plumber, by the way, but plumbers do 4 years of tech out here in Australia to learn pressure and flow. Now, if you're a plumber, I'm only mucking around. I love plumbers. I actually wanted to be a plumber myself, but I was told I had to do a trade first. Full disclosure, I've been told I have to insert this. Yes, plumbing is a trade in Australia, and yes, they are highly skilled people. So please don't take offense. I'm only joking. If you're a plumber, give me a shout out in comments. Plumbers are great, and they're very skilled. Moving on. Point being is, if there's a lot of pressure, blood would have been everywhere, particularly with the injuries that were inflicted. But when PC Neil turned up, he said, I didn't really see any obvious signs of these injuries until he looked a bit further. Robert Paul said first the body's warm, and then he said the body was cold. In fact, Robert Paul was all over the show. He gave differing reports, or it was reported wrong by the press, but we'll assume Robert Paul gave differing reports to these journalists, and then at the inquest, a couple of weeks later when they find him and drag him in there because he didn't want to lose a day's pay, his story changes pretty well much again. Because at one point, Robert Paul said, I went on my own to find the police, but PC Miser knew that there were two people there that he ran into in Hanbury Street. So I really wouldn't trust much of what that particular witness had to say on the subject. And as highlighted, Lechmere very well could have easily have hidden his gloves and his knife, even if he didn't have an apron. Now, in comments, people brought up the walking time issue, and some of you have actually walked that distance, and yes, admittedly, the streets have changed, and you cannot trust Google Maps to tell you how long it takes to walk somewhere. In fact, out in an area where I live, there's lots of little national parks, and there's walking trails, and it will tell you how long it would take you to get from one spot to another. And there's one particular one I found interesting, because a friend of mine said, come and have a look at this place. It's amazing. So I turned up and I said, but it says it's an hour and 10-minute walk. We don't have an hour and 10 minutes to get there and get back, and it'll be dark by the time we get home. And there'll be kangaroos out on the highway. And yes, that is real in Australia. When you live regional, you will see kangaroos on the highway. That is not made up. As well as drop bears. We get drop bears out west. That is also not made up. The point, though, was that particular walk only took 20 minutes. And I wasn't power walking. So I don't know who timed that, or if they decided that hour and 10 minutes had to be with someone on a walking frame, just in case they sued them by saying, you told me it was only 20 minutes and it took me an hour and 10. And on the way home I ran into a kangaroo and now you have to fix my headlight. Again, a bit of a rant there, but the thing is, yes, the walking time itself can be variable. But I would still say, regardless, Lechmere, according to his statements, would have had little time in Bucks Row unless he left his house a lot earlier. But then we come to the interaction between Lechmere and PC Misen in Hanbury Street. Now, Misen says that Lechmere said to him, there's a policeman waiting for you back there. And there was a policeman when Misen got there. But at the inquest, and we're only talking a few days later, Lechmere says, no, never said that. So who would you trust? Who would you believe in that particular instance? I think it would be safe to say that most of us would trust what the policeman said. But it doesn't seem to be that he was challenged on that much at all. But remembering, now this I think is very critical. I believe that had he have gone to that inquest 2 weeks later, well, I think more questions definitely would have been asked, because 2 weeks later, they're holding the inquest for Polly Nichols after the Annie Chapman crime has occurred. But he's got in there before they really see the threat. So him saying whether he said there was a policeman waiting for this constable or not, probably at the time wasn't a big issue, and for some reason, Lechmere seems to just disappear off the radar after this, because he really only comes into this saga as an eyewitness to the scene in Bucks Row, until obviously recent times. But was Lechmere actually telling the truth, and did the constable get it wrong? Well, you've got to remember, now, PC Misen is now faced with two blokes approaching him in the dark, telling him of this story. They've only got these gas lights that they carry around. And the problem there is, now, I don't know, if you've got a gas light and you're in the dark, how are you going to take your notes? You'd have to get your pen and paper out, but now it's in the dark. So did they take notes whilst they were talking? It's suggested that he got the details off both these gentlemen. That's definitely not confirmed 100%. In fact, that is disputed, that he got any details off either of them, but they managed to find both of them. Now, I'd have to ask the question, and I have not found any information on this, but was PC Misen known for his meticulous note-taking, or was he a bit slap-happy with it? Now, if he had that reputation, I could understand why the coroner just wouldn't challenge Lechmere. Say, yep, no, understand. You know, he just misheard, but he wrote down what he thought he heard later, because when he got round the corner, he saw a policeman. So in his mind, when he's writing his notes later on, he thought, oh, you told me a policeman was already there. But what if Lechmere did say that? Why would he do so, knowing at the time there was no policeman back in Bucks Row when he left? And we know that's a fact because PC Neil, who found the body, said that there was nobody there and he didn't see anybody in Bucks Row, which is odd considering they should have crossed each other, as was discussed in the last video. Well, it's fair to say that if you've committed a crime and you would say there's a policeman already back on the scene, they're going to assume, the policeman is going to assume you've already been checked out. You've probably already given your details to him. They maybe even give you a frisk to find out, like what's on your person. So there's no need for him to double up doing that. So be on your way then, see you later. And that's pretty well much what happened. So I think that particular piece of information hinges on the reliability of that police constable taking accurate notes. Now, an interesting point is made about the fact Lechmere refused to prop up the body. Now, remembering it said that Robert Paul was pulling the dress down for the modesty's sake and then said, look, let's prop her up. Now, I don't know what would motivate you to even do that. To think of finding someone dead on the side of the road and then thinking you're just going to sit them up beats me. But, if I was on that scene, I'd be like, you're on your own, buddy. I'm not touching it. And it's not because I've committed the crime. It's just that would freak me out. See, I do not watch surgery shows. Can't stand them. I don't like horror either. I don't mind true crime, which is very weird. But as you know on this channel, I don't go into the gruesome, gory details of the particular injuries and crimes and all that sort of thing. And that is actually by choice because it really creeps me out and I find it totally unnecessary when discussing these things, because I think rather than how it happened and what was done, I want to know why and who. But the fact that Lechmere refused to does raise some questions. Firstly, he could be like me, just creeped him out and didn't want to touch it. But if he did the crime, why would he not want to touch the body? It would make sense to do so. Now, I know DNA wasn't around, but if he had to move the body around and ended up some blood on his hands and a policeman they ran into noticed that, it'd be like, oh, that must have happened when I touched the body. So refusing to touch the body would suggest that he obviously had no physical evidence on him that could tie him to the crime. So either that proves that he definitely didn't do it, or that he was very cunning about it. But it does lead to a little tangent with Robert Paul. Why did he want to prop up the body? It's not suggested he had any medical knowledge at all. What good motive was there in doing that other than him getting his hands on the body, touching it, and then having a plausible explanation as to why maybe some of that crime scene was on him? That could very well explain why they definitely did look into Robert Paul as a possible perpetrator of these crimes, particularly after the Annie Chapman crime, and they dragged him into the inquest to go through him like a dose of salts. Now, some people mention that he's not the serial killer type because he had 11 kids and a wife, and he was married to that wife all the way through. When he passed away, left her a bit of money because, remembering, he started his own grocer business later in life. So he did okay for himself. Well, I would have to say then you'd be absolutely shocked by some of the serial killers that have come and gone over the course of time since then. And probably before then, who knows. But the point is, that is actually the description of some of these people. They have a perfectly normal family life. And so when they get arrested and they get caught, the family are totally shocked. They think, how could have he gone and done this? It just doesn't make any sense. He couldn't have. Until the evidence comes out, and then they're shocked for a totally different reason. They were living with a monster. So it can happen. But it's said that his attitude at the inquest, and he was really, really cagey, suggests that he had something to hide. Now, I can see why people would jump to that conclusion 100% absolutely, and why a lot of connections have been made to Charles Lechmere as being Jack the Ripper. But there's also another plausible explanation for his attitude at that inquest. Remembering in the previous video we spoke about what I referred to as the early event, where driving his cart, some poor lad, 4-year-old boy, lost his life, run over by Charles Lechmere's cart. We assume it's the same person just for the sake of this. Now, if you went to that coronial inquest for that as the person who drove that cart, and you knew in your mind it was just an accident, and you're only solely there to give evidence, well, you'd be in for the shock of your life. Why? Because now you're realizing everything you say could hinge on whether you're a free man for the rest of your life or not. If you say the wrong thing, someone could jump on that and make you look guilty. Now, some of the eyewitnesses didn't exactly think that Charles Cross's, because that's the name given at the coronial inquest, that his version of events matched what they saw. Some did, but others didn't. Now, you would realize that you're actually on trial here. This may not go the way you thought it was going to go. So the judiciary now has no longer become your friend. And that's why when you watch any true crime, many people will tell you, even if you're innocent, get a lawyer straight away. Now, I find it strange, but I've never been in the situation where I've needed to make that choice. But I could easily understand why when you think, look, I've got nothing to hide, I'll talk to the police, I'll talk to whoever. But many innocent people have gone to prison. Because, you know, you can talk yourself into prison even when you're totally innocent. And it has happened. Now, if you've gone through that experience, that would make you very nervous now. And he didn't go to prison for that. They did say it was an accidental death. But the point is, I think you would have walked out realizing that it was not the process you thought it was going to be, and now you've found a dead body. Well, you're going to be very selective in what you're going to say. You've probably now had advice from people saying, yeah, no, don't go telling the whole story. Too many words, people will tie you to something. So go in and just answer questions directly. Don't divulge anything unless you are asked. And I can see how that would explain away his attitude at that inquest, rather than trying to hide something that he did, just trying to not give too much information so he doesn't get pinned for something that he didn't. So now we get to the name of Cross. And was that a deceptive thing that he was doing? Well, possibly, but not necessarily because he was trying to hide who he was, because I think they knew who he was in a way and where he worked. But why would he drop the name Cross in Hanbury Street with P.Z. Misen? Well, it's likely because his stepfather was a policeman, a well-known policeman on the force. So the name Cross, no doubt, would have triggered something in some of these policemen's mind, or at least so he would have hoped. And perhaps he thought he might get some better treatment, who knows, but some people have said he used that to hide the fact from his family that he was doing these things, and I just find that myself, and let me know in comments if you disagree still, but I just don't see that as happening. Because surely his wife knew of the connection with the Cross name. Surely the wife read the papers. People got papers back then. There was no TV. There was no YouTube. How would you get your information but by getting the daily paper? And if she had have seen splashed on the front page of what happened in Bucks Row and Charles Cross and Robert Paul were there, do you not think that would stand out? That she'd go, my goodness, and when he came home, hey, is that you mentioned in the paper? And if he tried to deny it and then had to sneak away to an inquest, I think would be more suspicious. But that's just me. I could be totally wrong about that, but that's just how I see it. I don't think the name itself has much bearing either on the guilt or innocence of Charles Lechmere. But interestingly, Sir Melville McNaughton, who came into the investigation after all the crimes were committed, remember he said, well, we basically know who did it. We're not bringing it out for the sake of the family. It has been suggested that they knew it was Charles Lechmere and they didn't want a policeman's name to be dragged through the mud, so they just let it slide under the carpet. I find that also hard to believe if they knew that Lechmere was the criminal and similar crimes were still going on after Melville McNaughton made that comment. I just think that would be strange. Why wouldn't they just drag him in and arrest him? Because... And call him Lechmere. You're not dragging the cross name through the mud. And yes, I am still on the fence on this one. Which side would I take? Would I take up the defense side or would I take up the prosecution? Well, it is a tough one because I can see both arguments at the moment. And that's how I'm looking at this particular suspect from the point of view, if I went to court, could I prove it either way? And no, I don't have a law degree. But if anyone out there, and if it's allowed, I don't know if it is, but if you need someone to go ask some questions at court and maybe do a closing argument, well, you know, for the right motivation, bit of money, it could happen. Unless you're guilty. I couldn't defend a guilty person. So if I was going through the case and went, no, actually, mate, I reckon you did this, I'd be walking away, regardless of the money. But let me know what you think of this one. We did go over some old ground from the last video, but I had to make this sort of explanation video from your comments. So basically all of you out there wrote this video. Thank you very much. It does mean a lot. Thank you all for watching. So if you are still around here, give us a like, give us a subscribe. Thank you again to everyone who is sharing these. I'm Owen. You've been watching The Pub Test, and we'll see you on the next one.